Welcome to Save Democracy. We have a very special guest today. Jay Garfield is Doris Silbert Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy and Buddhist Studies, emeritus at Smith College, visiting Professor of Buddhist Philosophy at Harvard Divinity School, and Professor of Philosophy at Melbourne University. Professor Garfield's research addresses topics in the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, the history of modern Indian philosophy, epistemology, ethics, the nature of normativity, and topics in Buddhist philosophy. He's the author or editor of over 30 books and over 200 articles. Firstly, Jay, can I just say hello?
Hello. It's very nice to meet you, Katherine, and very nice to have you with me. I'm really honored to be on your show.
Oh, it's an honour to have you here. Thank you, Jay. So just to explain a little bit of an understanding as to why we're having this conversation. So the journey of mindfulness that I've been on for some time, off and on, has led me to get a bit more decluttered around how I see the world and to also become calmer about how I engage in the world, and also to kind of get a bit of an understanding what's the next best thing for me to focus on. So I kind of helped get sort of greater clarity. And underneath a lot of the issues in the world is actually the foundations of what we're all walking on and standing upon, which for many of us is democracy in various states of disrepair. And so I thought I should really turn to this and to offer an invitation to be on a journey to understand what democracy is really all about, why it's so important, why it's important to the quality of our lives, and if we're not careful, it can slip away. And then also to understand how to calmly and constructively engage in the world without, getting too knocked sideways by the noise and the fear and the rapid pace of change. And so, Jay, just wanted to give a general introduction as to why we wanted to go down this journey with you. And I'm just really grateful that you're here, whatever you'd like to explore.
Wow, that's a really interesting set of questions and interesting set of problems. I suppose it's worth recalling that when we think about democracy, a lot of people think about democracy in terms of elections. You've got a democratic country if you hold a bunch of elections. And I honestly think that's really mistaking a minor feature, well, not a minor feature, but a feature of democracy for what democracy is. Elections are a mechanism. They're not democracy in effect. And it's more important, I think, to recognize that democracy means that we're organizing our societies together by the demos, by the people. And it's also important to recognize that what that means is we do that because we think that that form of organization has a legitimating function. And if we lose sight of that process of legitimation, we really start losing sight of what democracy is all about. So, for instance, when we have people who are holding public offices and they perform certain kinds of actions, we think those actions are legitimate if they're in accord with laws and statutes, illegitimate if they violate them. But we can also ask a question about laws and statutes. Are they legitimate, or are they themselves anti-democratic or somehow venal? When we do that, we often measure them against the Constitution, either an implicit constitution, as in Great Britain, or an explicit written constitution, such as here in Australia or in the United States. And we think that the function of a constitution, something that we've all kind of assented to, is that it can legitimate or determine the illegitimacy of laws and actions. But then if we ask the question, the very deeper question, what legitimates that constitution? Then we're really up against it. We could try to tell the sort of mythology of the social contract tradition and say that once upon a time, our forebears got together in a jungle and organized a meeting to ratify a constitution. That doesn't do very much because, of course, the very fact that some people sometime in the past agreed to or might have agreed to something doesn't bind us or legitimate anything now. A constitution gets its legitimacy because of common consent, because we have enough solidarity that we're all behind it. And what that means is that human solidarity is really what's at the base of democratic legitimacy. And we often lose track of that. And I think that when we see democracy in decline, what we're really seeing is solidarity in decline. And sometimes the decline of that solidarity is, we might say, accidental. Maybe things are happening so that some people start distrusting others. But it may also be that it's intentional, that those who think that they can benefit from a decline of democracy actually sow divisions and break solidarity. And I think that's what we're seeing in the rise of kind of divisive populism, racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and so forth, that we're seeing in so much of the decline of democracy around the world today. Anyway, that's just something that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, and thinking that when we really ask what's at the basis of a democratic society, it's not a bunch of laws, it's trust. It's mutual trust that builds solidarity, that allows us to think that we're all roughly in the same project. And trust can allow us not only to agree, but it can also allow us to disagree with civility. You and I might disagree about a policy, or we might disagree about the value of a work of art, or we might disagree about the wisdom of a certain kind of practice. We might even disagree about matters of etiquette. But if we trust one another, then we trust one another to engage in discussion and disagreement thoughtfully, responsibly, charitably, and with the goal of resolving problems rather than with the goal of exacerbating them. When trust erodes, democracy erodes. And so very often what we have to ask ourselves if we're trying to preserve democracy or to strengthen a democracy is how we build trust and how we build social solidarity.
Yeah, so you're really pointing to trust and solidarity, and there's just this sense in the way things are for many of us in urban life, in online life, that there's a sort of increasing atomization, and there's less of an inclination towards solidarity in the way our lives operate today,
Yep.
the way we go about our daily life. There's a sort of epidemic of loneliness, and people exist within bubbles, online and offline. People live in gated communities. There seems to be social forces at play that really exacerbate this atomization
Yep.
and go directly against what you're talking about of solidarity and trust. A lot of the people I've spoken to talk about the importance of civil society for the health of democracy, and that it starts in the church hall and the community centre and forming a group locally and building networks, and this again speaks to solidarity and trust, because you're mixing with your local community and they're all different types of people. You're no longer in a bubble, and there's a gradual sort of increasing trust and solidarity by the nature of that effort, no matter how challenging it can be sometimes. You've got a sort of single mission and you're doing some endeavour together and learning to disagree agreeably. And so I just wanted to speak to this question of how do we rebuild trust and solidarity in the context of an increasing, all the forces going the other way, or at least it seems that way sometimes.
Yeah, I think some of that involves something to which you adverted at the very beginning when you used the word mindfulness, which I'm hearing in part as a kind of attentiveness. And it requires being attentive to what is valuable in our own lives, but also to what is being done to erode trust and solidarity so that we can better resist it. Because a lot of what happens below a level of reflective attention and affects us very deeply, even though we don't notice what's going on. That's when it's most powerful. An 8th century Buddhist philosopher who I like to work on a lot, Shantideva, argued that moral vice always begins in fear. And so what he was particularly concerned with was fear of death, which leads us to try to strengthen our own egos, to try to find a way to live forever, which leads us to sort of gate our community so that nobody can come in and harm us, which leads us to try to amass as many goods as we can for ourselves and to see life as a zero-sum game, that leads us to make sure we undermine others so they don't become our rivals and so forth. And that fear can be extraordinarily powerful, and that's what really erodes solidarity. And if you pay attention to populist rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric that really is aimed at undermining democracy, a great deal of it, if not almost all of it, is devoted to raising levels of fear of immigrants, fear of crime, fear of change, fear of the decay of a particular kind of moral order or family arrangements, fear of what equity might mean for people who have enjoyed privileged positions, and so forth. And it's the cultivation of fear that is the mechanism by means of which opponents of democracy really undermine it. If we don't notice that, if we think that, for instance, a debate about immigration policy is simply a neutral debate about how to manage our borders, or a neutral debate about who should get visas and who shouldn't, that's being engaged in a dispassionate way, we've missed the point. The point is that what's happening is somebody's trying to stoke fear and divide us. If we think that a debate about parental leave and whether we should be offering parental leave to young parents is simply a debate about employment policy rather than an attempt to raise fear about women entering the workplace, then we've missed the point completely. And so I think that it's really important to raise our level of attentiveness to when our emotions are being manipulated and to when our fear is being aroused, so that we can say, wait a minute, you don't have a right to make me afraid. I'm not going to be afraid of this. And to engage in a kind of resoluteness and a kind of banding together with those who are victimized in various ways by that fear-mongering, to recognize that we are in a common position, all the victims of that sort of rhetoric. I think that's really important. I mean, it sounds in a way kind of obvious or kind of silly, but that's really the root of it. When we understand that the root of democracy is in trust and solidarity, and that the fundamental way to attack that is to inspire irrational fear, we've got to be attentive to the nature of that fear. And so in response to that, we have to cultivate alternative attitudes of genuine friendship and solidarity, attitudes of care for those who are immediately suffering as a part of that, attitudes of a kind of impartiality that doesn't kind of take our own position as somehow privileged. And if we can't do that, then we kind of deserve to lose our democracy, because those are the foundations of a democratic order, are very deep psychological attitudes and shared psychological attitudes. That's what really generates this. Doesn't mean agreement about everything, but it does mean the sense that whatever our disagreements, our unity is far more important than that. So when you take for instance, the official motto of the United States, something almost nobody even reflects on anymore, E pluribus unum. It's not that there is one nation out of 13 colonies when that slogan was coined. It was that you get one populace out of diverging views if you've got a basis for unity. And that unity is a sense of shared purpose. That's not to say that there was a shared purpose at that time. A lot of people were enslaved. But it is to say that that was an ideal, and an ideal, I think, worth fighting for.
Yes. And you mentioned a key word, which is not easy, impartiality.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, especially in terms of people in the community who may not be consciously spreading fear, may not be consciously trying to manipulate others, but are perhaps being manipulated themselves, and are kind of spokespeople for the fears you talk about, because the people behind them, or at least stoking the fear, know which buttons to press. And so there might be this sort of unintentional, unconscious spreading of fear. And if you're facing that in your community, and it's something I'm scared about, frankly. How do I mean, it's nice in theory.
Yeah.
But how do I kind of really try to bring that energy of solidarity underneath all of the noise when I'm meeting somebody face to face who has very strong views that are very fearful, and I'm trying to kind of not privilege my own view.
Right.
And try to find this impartiality, and try to find a kind of meaningful moment where we both see each other's humanity, and perhaps it diffuses any negative energy that may have arisen, and there's a sort of base for solidarity going forward. It's interacting with people who are maybe less conscious than the fear mongers, but are in fact spreading fear without really realizing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think there's a few things to say about that, quite a few, in fact. One is that oftentimes what we're looking at in circumstances of that kind are the deliberate cultivation of what Marx felicitously called false consciousness, so that people are being told that their interests lie in one place where they in fact lie in another. Ex-President of the United States, Harry Truman, once said that you can always count on the American working class to vote against their own interests. And that was because people carefully educated members of that class to misalign their interests and to believe that their interests were always aligned with capital. And sometimes what's necessary in order to begin to build the basis of a conversation is a conversation about what our interests are, what we hope for, what our goals are, and to begin by finding whatever shreds of common ground there are. Because it's in discovering those shreds of common ground that you can begin to then address the questions that divide us. It only makes sense to begin a conversation where we disagree if we can find out where we agree, so that there's some premises that we share. And also, again, to always be aware, as you pointed out, that when we enter conversation, whether it's political conversation, moral conversation about art, conversation about the weather, that we begin that by suggesting that the conversation is a joint practice, not I giving a lecture to somebody, and not an attempt necessarily to convince anybody that they need to agree. Sometimes when we begin a conversation in the context of disagreement, each party comes in with the view that I win the game if I get the other person to agree with me. And then the goal doesn't become building a relationship. The goal becomes winning a debate. It's extraordinarily important, again, to use your idea about mindfulness, to be attentive to our own tendency to do that. And if I find that I'm in a conversation and what I'm trying to do is win, it might be a good time to take a long, deep breath and say to the other person, look, and to say it honestly, it's not important to me that you agree with me. What I want to do is to understand your perspective, and I'd like you to understand mine. And if we can come away with an understanding of how two people who agree about so much disagree about some particular points, then maybe that will allow us to reflect more deeply on those points. And to continually bring the point of the conversation back to mutual understanding and discovery of common ground, rather than trying to win a debate. And I have to say that in much of the world, our politicians, our leaders, even our religious leaders, don't always set a good example for that kind of conversation. Very often, public discourse is set up as debate, whether it's question time in Parliament or a debate between candidates, or the editorial pages of a newspaper where we find one conservative and one liberal and have them fight about a particular issue, or, it just goes on again and again and again, and we valorize that kind of gladiatorial approach to discourse. A gladiatorial approach to discourse is a way of generating divisions, reifying them, and perpetuating them, rather than a way of repair. Repair requires attentiveness and humility. And if we can't speak with humility and attentiveness, then we're hopeless.
It's worrying, because where I sit in the UK and where I'm from, Australia, if you approach, say, politics, for example, with anything other than, I've got alligator skin and, I can handle the robustness of the fight, the gladiatorial combat. If you have anything less than that, it's a deficiency.
Yeah.
It's a sort of perceived as you're unsuited to politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to speak too about the noise. And I have learnt through my own journey how to cultivate peace in my day, even if I'm in the middle of a lot of demanding activities, or I'm in a big urban environment, or whatever the different contributions are to the noise, or maybe personally I'm going through something. And um, and so I've been able to cultivate that so that I can be very selective about news sources, very selective about what I'm consuming, as the Buddhists
Yeah.
would say, in all the ways that's meant. And I just wondered if you could speak to that, because a lot of our listeners are worried about democratic decline, but they're also um, affected or part of this modern world. And you constantly hear it again and again. I just need to, get in a rowboat and snip the rope and
Yeah.
just go and drift off, because I can't cope with this anymore. And especially listening to geopolitics and how things are changing so rapidly. It's so discombobulating for people. And I just wondered if you could just speak to the kind of ways in which you can cultivate actual calm, and that's a much more sort of nourishing way to look after yourself as you engage, rather than retreating and just saying no thanks, I'm not having anything to do with it, because we actually need people to be calm and constructive
Mm.
and contribute. So just, yeah, whatever you can share on that front, that'd be great.
Yeah. I think one of the things to think about in that context is anger versus patience. I think anger is the most destructive attitude and the most destructive emotion that we can have. And again, a lot of political discourse is shot through with anger, and anger is often valorized. And anger is often valorized not only by people in power, but by people who whose hearts are in a certain sense in the right place. People who are involved in liberation movements, people who are involved in the defense of the downtrodden will sometimes argue that if you're not angry at injustice, then you really don't care. Now, it's worth thinking about what anger does to us. For all of the people who are listening to this, ask yourself when the last time you said to yourself, God, I was so angry, I completely lost it. I was really at my best. I was thinking so clearly. I'm so proud of what I did then. Anger is one of those emotions that's always destabilizing. It decreases our ability to think rationally. It causes us to do things that we later have to apologize for. It dims our perception so that we can't hear and see as well. I mean, and even, if we were to turn to domains of conflict, when you think about, say, somebody studying martial arts, the first thing they're taught is get your emotion out of the conflict, get your anger out of the conflict, because when you're angry, you don't perceive well, you don't react well, you don't think rationally. We're often encouraged to get angry, sometimes for bad reasons,
Yeah.
sometimes for good reasons.
Yeah.
I would say always resist that. And if there are stimuli that you know are going to make you angry, then as long as you know they're going to make you angry, stay away from them. Or think carefully and slowly in another frame about how you could engage with those without becoming angry. Now, that doesn't mean you have to approve of injustice and that you have to approve of wrongdoing. It does mean that your disapproval should take the form of what I like to call righteous indignation rather than anger. The great 6th century Buddhist scholar Buddhaghosa, when talking about the cardinal Buddhist virtues that we've mentioned earlier, friendship, care, equanimity, being able to rejoice in the welfare of others, pointed out that each of these virtues, and any virtue you can mention, always comes both with a far enemy and a near enemy, to use his terms. So when we talk about friendship, the far enemy might be hostility, but the near enemy is partiality, wanting good for somebody else because it makes me feel good. And one of the things that Buddhaghosa points out is that genuine virtues, whether these are moral virtues, civic virtues, political virtues, are always non-egocentric. But there are always vices lurking around the corner that feel just like their virtues, but are egocentric. So if I get really angry because injustice makes me feel bad, then the reason for my action is my feeling bad, not the injustice. If I can have indignation with regard to injustice and know that regardless of whether it makes me feel bad or not, it's wrong and ought to be countered, then I can think rationally and dispassionately. So kind of the moral of this story that begins with thinking about anger is to begin by thinking about anger, but then end up thinking about egocentricity. Because the more our moral life is governed by our egocentricity, by how we ourselves feel and react, the less effective we're going to be as agents, whether political agents or moral agents. And the more non-egocentric we can be, the more we can really take others' interests as reasons for action, or general principles as reasons for action, rather than our own interests, the more effective we're going to be. So I think that calm is best found in a kind of relinquishing of egocentricity. Agitation comes when I start thinking too much about my own situation. And so thinking that Shantideva has a beautiful line in Bodhicharyavatara where he says, all of the ills in the world are caused by people pursuing their own happiness. And all of the happiness in the world is caused by people pursuing others' happiness. And I think that's really important. It says, stop being egocentric and you can be an agent for change. Be egocentric and you're going to be an absolutely incompetent moral agent and an incompetent political agent. And when we think about the politicians we all despise the most, they're the most egocentric.
Mm. And I love how you pointed to many things that you just said, but one I just pull one thread is the state it puts you in, and you just become less efficacious. You
Yeah.
just become, you lose clarity. Yeah, that's beautiful. I just wanted to ask you a question. This is a little self-indulgent, and but there may be listeners out there who know what I'm talking about. When you're a person who is a bit a visual person and you envision different futures for society and community and humanity and the planet, and but you dare not say them out loud sometimes because they can be quite positive, and because you can see and you can perceive human potential, but you just become a subject of ridicule if you put them to paper, unless you turn it into a fictional story of some kind
or song.
And I just wondered if you got any kind of tips for us, people who are like that and have this strong desire to project positive visions for humanity, but it's a hostile environment for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Barack Obama called that the audacity of hope.
Yes.
And when he said that, I thought you nailed it, right? Hope seems audacious. It seems to take an enormous amount of courage. But I would say we need to have the courage to hope. Without that, there's really not much point. And there are reasons to hope. I think that even though we right now live in a point where things have been turning pretty bad, if we look at the broad arc of human history, it is a story of progress. It's not a story of monotonic progress. It doesn't keep progressing all the time. It goes up and it goes down. But the arc, as Martin Luther King said, even though it's long, it bends towards justice. And if we can help it bend in that way and have enough hope to think that what we do makes a difference, I think that's useful. It's worth remembering that everything we do does leave effects. Sometimes the effects seem very local, but ripples that can be local can spread very far. And if we simply remember that every action we perform, every word that we say, every thought that we have is going to have effects, and we can become forces for good and forces for progress, or we can become retrograde forces. And that's a choice we each have. You might sometimes be ridiculed for being audaciously hopeful, or for being generous even. But those are things that it's worth being ridiculed for, because when you demonstrate those qualities, somebody else is looking and says, I could do that too. And I think that's really important. I think that's just extraordinarily important. Aristotle puts it beautifully when he says, how we raise our children makes a big difference, or rather all the difference. And he had in mind the examples that we set.
Yes. Well, that's beautiful, Jay. That's a beautiful moment to end on. And really, it's been very inspiring talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Katherine. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please post a review or rating. We're new, and a one-line review has a huge impact in helping others to find us. Thank you for your support.